Martin Amis is here. His previous books include Money, The Information, and Experience. His new book is called Yellow Dog. It is his first novel since 1995. It made the long list of finalists for the Booker Prize. I am pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome back.
Thank you, Johnny.
We'll talk about this. Why has it been 5 years?
You
look like a book a year man to me.
I have been writing almost a book a year, but at a certain point, I decided that I'd eventually have to write about my father, and so I put the novel, when my father died, Kingsley Amis, I put the novel aside and wrote a memoir, and then didn't feel quite ready to come back to fiction, so I wrote another memoir. This is the one with the emphasis on Stalin and my father's political past as a communist, and then returned to fiction on round about September the 12th, 2001. Not the best time to resume.
A day after.
Well, it was around then. And on that day, like every other writer on earth, I was seriously considering a change of occupation.
Meaning?
Well, I just thought writing literature was a sort of frippery that we would have to do without.
We had no longer time to indulge in literature, so to speak?
No, more that the voice coming from your study felt like such a squeak. Yeah. Dwarfed by this enormous event, and also a sort of sick, shocked feeling, and a loss of faith in reason or everything else that you hold dear. But then your fighting spirit gets going, and I came back to the novel thinking this is still going to be a comic novel, insisting on that. But also that comedy itself, like everything else, had been slightly changed by this event, and that it wasn't going to be the same kind of comedy. It was going to be something a little bit more rancid and uneasy.
Before I turn to that, tell me about what you see as the implications of 9/11.
Well,
what does it mark?
The end of the age of normalcy.
Really?
Well, that was what they said as the First World War was coming to an end. I think Woodrow Wilson said, we will now return to the age of normalcy. But there hasn't been an age of normalcy for an awful long time, I think. But September the 11th marked, for me, an attack not just on civilization, but an attack on reason. And to take up the earlier point, although it's minor in the greater scheme of things, humor depends on reason. As the writer Clive James said, humor is just common sense dancing. And if you haven't got a sense of humor, you haven't got any common sense either.
Yes.
Shouldn't be trusted with anything. But an attack on morality and reason, and on your basic familial trust, and such an injection of randomness and danger and arbitrariness that I found that I'd lost faith in. I didn't enjoy looking at my children anymore in the same way for a while.
How did you now look at them?
Well, I looked at them with a sort of apologetic air and a slightly sick feeling that you can never protect your children. It's an illusion that you can. But this seemed to me to underline the impossibility of that. That I'm sorry. I'm sorry you're here because
the world is getting.
The world went down, in my opinion, and therefore certain guarantees that seemed to be present were no longer present.
You have been opposed to the Iraqi war. And just according to what I understand about what you've written.
Yes.
At the same time, coming out of that, do you feel, because of that the United States lost its way in responding to 9/11?
Well, yes. My theory is that you wouldn't have expected America to brush off this enormous millennial event that will reverberate for at least a century.
No one in the world did, I don't think. I don't think anybody said, America, why don't you turn the other cheek?
Well, it's not just that, but I thought of America sort of staggering around as if in shock, and looking for an enemy, and perhaps misdirecting its gaze.
Well, it had an enemy. I mean, it understood A, terrorism, B, Al-Qaeda. Did not necessarily know where to find them, but...
Well, not at all, no. And there was this very loose connection posited by Bush time and again in a shameless way, saying that, you know, they brought violence to us, we'll take violence back to them. But the them and the us weren't the same. So I felt it was not a rational response, and a rush of blood and all that. But the minute they went in, I wasted not a second thinking we were right and you were wrong. Instantly, passionately wanted, A, for them to find weapons of mass destruction, and for the occupation to succeed. You know, a lot has been written about, oh, it's so tempting to say we were right. I don't believe we are proven to be right yet. And I said,
being
the peaceniks,
yeah.
Those that were opposed to the war. But you know, having gone in, then you take up the position that it has to succeed. And I'm far more worried now about American retreat rather than, you know, them having gone in the first place.
You've written some things about Bush, but suggesting that this religion is central to the way he sees the world.
Well, he has called it a faith-based administration. He, you know, invokes God, and the whole axis of evil business, you know, it was originally called the axis of hatred.
I saw the way you had sort of traced the earlier drafts to that, how it went from ending up with axis of evil.
Because Bush wanted it to be more theological. Now, why in a world, you know, trembling with faith and fear, you should want things to be more theological rather than less? September the 11th has been a great blow, as it were, for secularism. It's shown us, has it not, that it is time to discard that along with all other ideologies. And this is the most primitive one of all. And it's very strange to think that Saddam, although he, for instance, has a Quran in a public place written in his own blood, he had several transfusions over several years, and there it is. But that's merely a sop to the mullahs, and in fact he is a secularist, and the Ba'ath regime has always been secular. So in a very odd sense, Saddam is psychologically, you know, a little bit more sophisticated than Bush, who is a passionate believer. I came across a great bit of Conrad the other day, one of the most passionate bits of secularist rhetoric I've ever seen, where he says it's religion that that vulgarizes and distorts our most intimate relations with the living and the dead. It's time, I think, that the secularists seize the high ground and should no longer feel that they are somehow less spiritual than the religious folks. I think that's just a category error. And it's more spiritual and it's more demanding to have a realistic idea of what death is and what life is than it is to have this...
It's more spiritual to have that.
Yeah, it's more grown up and more spiritual.
Mature.
Yeah, to accept what death is and what life is without these ancient distortions and palliatives of religion.
You also said that the death of your sister affected the writing in Cope with the Dead.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Cope with the Dread.
You know, I was blamed for comparing small things with large, and I did do that. I mean, I talked about my sister's death in a book that was about the deaths of at least 20 million people, and
at the hands of Stalin.
At the hands of Stalin, and you know, I make no apologies for extrapolating from, you know, if in a you know, in a prosperous middle class life, unterrorized on the whole by society, you know, utterly free, doing what I want to do. If a familial death can have this effect on me, then this gives you a clue to what happens when it's on an enormous scale. Stalin said that the death of an individual is a tragedy. The death of a million is a mere statistic. you know, profoundly untrue. The death of a million is a million tragedies, to say the least, and more than that, because these tragedies proliferate in concentric circles around every death.
It also led to this conflict in this dialogue between you and Christopher Hitchens. What was that about?
Well, that was about
boys being boys.
No, it was about you know, just as my father was a communist until 1956, when he was in his mid-30s, and you know, Christopher Hitchens was a trot, you know, perhaps a little longer than he ought to have been. But you start these arguments when you are boys, perhaps when you're young men,
right?
And you continue them in your head. And you know, we were all having an argument with our fathers, whatever it's about.
You mean every son is having an argument with his father?
Always. And funnily enough, the death of the father doesn't halt that dialogue. It goes on and on. And perhaps you feel, now at last I can win it, now that he can't answer back.
But does this also mean that your life was driven by the notion of meeting your father's satisfaction?
Well, I think that again is universal. Most children of writers who are writers themselves tend to write one novel or one book of stories and then shut up shop, because the rivalrous feeling with the father or the mother, the writer, mother or father, has been satisfied by that. But I never felt that way.
Well, you went out and grabbed and achieved and worked yourself to death to earn a literary reputation. Or,
yeah,
or to write. I mean, you did it to write. I mean, you hoped that a literary reputation would be a byproduct of...
It was more that I felt I was in it for the long haul,
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
and I wasn't really doing it to have an effect on him.
Right.
It was for myself. But it doesn't mean that...
But would you always feel like he was over your shoulder there, judging?
I do often feel that I have to run a sentence past him and get the nod from him. But I think, you know, in comparison to other sons of writers, that I clearly, that wasn't it. You know, that it was a recognition in myself that I was there for the long haul.
But does that, I mean, is that in fact a tribute to him?
To his example,
yeah, the idea that you are there for the long haul, that you know, you looked at his life and it was one that had meaning to you.
Yeah, and his work ethic and his you know, modestly stated ambition, which was to find a little niche or niche in literature and occupy it, to be, as he put it, some good. That was enough for him.
And you?
Same. I mean, of course, another part of your brain is jabbering at you that you want to be the Dickens of your era. But to have made an impression on literature seems to me a good baseline.
To have made an impression?
Yeah.
Well, you've certainly done that.
Yeah, I suppose I have.
Or does the pursuit?
Well, it's the pursuit that is the thing, like the pursuit of happiness. You know, you can't realize it by pursuing happiness. You have to pursue something else.
Which brings me to this. Critics are having a field day. They are bloodying you.
Well, yes,
I
up
mean,
to a
obviously
point.
there are exceptions, but...
Yeah, on the whole, yes. And all I can say to that is that it's, you know, Norma Mailer said you don't want to be assimilated and patted on the back too quickly. I always would aim, you know, would hope for strictly 50-50 reviews. I'd like some people to be very keen, some people to be appalled by a new novel of mine. This is perhaps tipped more to the 60-40 or 70-30. But I like a violent response, and I think it's an original book, and it's going to take a little bit to sink in.
Okay, we'll have to talk about what it is, but just stay with this idea because it was just a whole, you know, it is the narrative we were on. you dramatically and vigorously reject the criticism that you see and read, saying yourself, that's just wrong, they didn't get it? Or do you say, well, maybe I didn't get there this time?
No, I don't say that. I felt very much in England that it wouldn't have mattered which of my books it was. Or indeed,
you were ripe for whipping.
Yeah, and it's a sort of culture war thing.
Culture war? What, between?
Well, it's you know, it's a stratum and a generation of so-called literary journalists who felt that it was time to turn the tables on me. In England, in America, it's not so violent one way or the other, but in England, there's an unconscious feeling that I was born in 1922, that nonetheless I wrote Lucky Jim when I was 7, that I'm now in my mid-80s, yet I'm going to be around for another 20 years.
So it began with Kingsley and extends to you.
Yes, and I've outstayed my welcome, and I'm seen as a kind of genetic elitist, as if, you know, my novels were all hardwired into me at my birth, and it's just been a question of taking dictation.
Now here, at the same time, you know, you think about and write about in essay form or in review form lots of powerful, big ideas. Whether it is the notion of where we are and normalcy and not normalcy, whether it is the meaning of death and all of that. But what is this book about?
I think it's about what I've always been writing about.
What it means to be a man?
Yes, exactly. The paradox of masculinity and how male insecurity leads to violence. Now that's not an original thought, but it's dramatized in original ways, I think, in that book.
Tell me about the book and how you came to construct it that way.
It's one of those novels, it's actually a Victorian convention, you could say, where it begins with 3 or maybe even 4 plot lines.
Right.
And the reader should be thinking, how are these going to be brought together? They're all to do, each story is to do with a crisis in masculinity, in male potency, both literal and metaphorical. And and they're brought together and resolved against a slightly exaggerated and satirized modern reality, where, which reflects the feeling you get, and it can be either productive or not, that when you reach a certain age, the world begins to look not wrong or right or attractive or unattractive, but it begins to look slightly alien to you. It's part of your preparation for leaving it. But I'm looking at the culture of, I suppose, the next generation after me, and finding it strange and writing about it in a way that
okay,
points
what
to
is it?
that.
The next generation after you is, you know, so what do you mean find? What do you find strange about it?
I feel that that a whole carapace of inhibition has been cast off in the last few years.
About
Well, loss of
license,
but loss of shame, loss of embarrassability. It seems to me a very contradictory culture that's coming up, because the emphasis is on equality, which has never been a very powerful American idea.
Right.
You know, liberty and fraternity, maybe,
right.
but not egality.
Right.
But the idea that looks are being democratized, that you know, all this scarification where you've got your door keys in one eyelid and your car keys in the other, as if the tyranny, the hierarchy, the elite of looks, which has always been very mysterious, why we find certain appearances more attractive than others. But this is to be obliterated in a kind of commonality. But while at the same time,
it's almost me. It's the pursuit of belonging.
Yeah, and identification with a tribe.
Right.
And so on.
Exactly.
But at the same time, you have rampant individualism, in which You know, this is a country consisting of 150 million superstars.
What about sex?
Um,
The degradation of sex. I mean, what do you spent time researching this in conversation with a porn star?
I did, and I wrote a piece about pornography in preparation for writing this book. Well, I call it the obscenification of everyday life, and it's you know, we thought we were doing this when I was in my 20s. We thought we were scandalizing the previous generation, and now they're scandalizing us. But it seems to me that it's you know, what we worry about when we're talking about sex in the next generation is that all significance will be drained from it. And having asked around, I now get the impression that sex education is not in the hands of some school mom with drawing a diagram on her blackboard. It's being administered by pornography, and the young are getting their sex education that way.
And to what conclusion?
To reduce it, you know, ad infinitum or ad vertigonem. It's a question of performance and repertoire, and doesn't stem from feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
it is about performance.
yes.
Yeah, and all the ads on the internet are about performance.
Yeah, and how to improve it.
Yeah. Okay. Where do you go from here? I mean, so now you're back writing novels.
Yeah.
Some critics said, you know, we wish he would address big ideas. You know, I guess big ideas may be in the eye of the beholder. You would think this is a big idea.
I think there are plenty of big ideas in that, and then you get attacked for being above your station. But and in England, the views of novelists on big ideas and on politics in general are considered of rather less interest than those of the man in the street. But I think I'm going to write now a longish autobiographical novel to combine, you know, the memoir experience and fiction in some way.
The Martin Amis story.
Indeed.
Are you really?
Yeah.
You know, why?
Well, I've left myself alone in that sense for 30-odd years. My first novel was autobiographical because when you're in your early 20s, there isn't anything else. So there's a lot stacked up, you know.
Okay. Talk to me a moment about how you prepare to do that.
You say the magic words of Nabokov. You say, "Speak memory."
Speak memory.
Yes. And you train the memory, as Nabokov spoke of doing, that you, memory is like a muscle, and you immerse yourself in it and see what it shows you. And it will have made all sorts of selections for you, and you will remember what you ought to remember.
Who, of all the writers, who has informed you the most among 4 or 5, 6, 3?
Well, I would have said, not long ago, I would have said Nabokov and Bellow, but now I think Bellow above Nabokov.
Really?
Yes, in the last couple of years I've come
Really? Because it has to do with you, not him. He hasn't done anything the last couple of years that would lead you to make that conclusion. His greatest works were not of the last 2 years.
No, indeed. But, you know, you keep rereading your personal gods, and...
Okay, but who else? Nabokov and Saul Bellow and...
Joyce, Kafka, but they don't speak to me with the immediacy that Bellow does.
Why?
Well, I think you can't. When you finish a Nabokov novel, you want to write like Nabokov. When you finish a Bellow novel, a long Bellow novel, you don't want to write at all because you feel it's all gone. You know, it's all been done.
Why am I doing
this?
Yes.
Yeah. And you feel,
or you feel I can never be this good. So therefore, what's this about?
You feel you couldn't even write the instructions on an aspirin packet when you've read The Adventures of Augie March.
Is that the great one? In your judgment?
Well, I've recently reread Herzog, and realized that I wasn't old enough to read it until recently, and that book struck me like Augie March as a kind of force of nature.
Yeah. That is where the competition is between the two, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. But
Does that come closest to being the great American novel?
Augie March, I
Yeah.
think, yes, I think it does. Because it's, yeah, all the trails went cold in 1953 when it came out.
Yeah.
Because it tells America what it is, from the immigrant experience outward.
Let me make one point here. Go ahead, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, no, go ahead.
One point here about this is that you have said what you would love for your readers to feel if you could achieve something, it would be the same enthusiasm you had as a young man reading Nabokov.
And Bellow.
And Bellow.
Yeah, that sense when you're...
What was that? Go ahead.
It's the sense when you're browsing through a library and you're picking up books and trying on various writers almost like outfits. And then suddenly you read someone and you can tell after half a page, you're saying, this one is speaking directly to me. He has me in mind. It's an illusion.
Yeah.
But, and then with a sudden nod, you say to yourself that I will have to read everything they've written and then reread it.
Because he is inside my head, or she is inside my head.
Exactly, yes.
She understands.
Yeah. It's as if she knows me and she's telling me exactly what I want to hear.
This book is called Yellow Dog, Martin Amis. It is always a pleasure to have him on this broadcast. And again, read Yellow Dog and decide for yourself. Thank you.
Many thanks.